An overnight adventure. Frank watched his lovely wife Carol as she slipped into the dress. Raising her arms and clasping the straps between her fingers, she let the blue silky dress fall easily over her torso. Then she let go of the straps and, swaying, gently pulled up the hem, and it fell into place, fitting her perfectly. She was beautiful, and he never tired of watching her dress. Tonight was going to be a good night for them, full of romance and passion. They had gone on their annual cross-country driving vacation, stopping where they wanted, seeing and doing what they wanted with no schedule or plan. Tonight they were in Wichita, Kansas. They spent the day visiting museums and public gardens, taking pictures of themselves, exploring the city, and enjoying the day. It was a typical example of their perfect day on the road, and tonight was going to be the perfect ending to a perfect day. "Stop staring at me, you silly goose!" Carol was playful and made sure Frank didn't take his eyes off her. Frank smiled as he watched his wife and said, "Isn't that a gander? Stop staring at me, you silly gander!" Carol only smiled, turned around, and wiggled her ass to win the argument. Frank liked to lose arguments this way. After getting cleaned up, they left the room and headed to dinner. For all anyone could see, they were one of hundreds of couples gathered to spend the evening at their leisure. They were staying at one of the better hotels that had an excellent dining room. Behind the dining room was a spacious bar with a dance floor, and tonight there was a live band playing there. It was the kind of evening that Carol and Frank had enjoyed while traveling, and they intended to make the most of it. The maitre d' turned out to be a pretty young woman of about 25 in a dress that fit her impeccably. Smiling at them both, she turned and escorted them to their table. Carol quietly scolded her husband. "Hey, look at me, mister!" Frank only smiled and looked at his wife. He knew she was joking and that he didn't need the young woman's attention to prepare for the night's adventure. Once they were seated, the waiter came over to take their drink order. She ordered a glass of white wine, saying, "I need to gather my thoughts. I want to memorize every moment of tonight." He ordered a bourbon on the rocks, saying, "Just one, and then I'll have a water, please." The waiter nodded politely without comment, as he had been trained to do, and soon returned with their drinks. "Do you want me to take your order, or do you want more time?" Frank smiled and said, "Actually, we were too busy talking to study the menu. Could you give us a few more minutes?" The waiter kindly left and returned about 10 minutes later to take their order. Carol asked, "How is the salmon cooked?" With carefully practiced formality, the waiter replied, "It's baked with brown sugar and balsamic glaze, then served with carrots and whipped potatoes." "That sounds wonderful. I'll take that, please." "And would madam like a salad to accompany this dish?" The waiter's accent was affected, but not offensive. "Yes. Do you have a simple garden salad with lettuce leaves and cranberry vinaigrette?" "Yes. We do." "Excellent." Turning to Frank, the waiter said, "And for the gentleman?" "I'd like a dry-aged ribeye, cooked medium rare." "Excellent choice, sir. And I'll have a salad as well." "Excellent. And the vegetable one?" The waiter scribbled quickly in his notebook. "I'll have the same as my wife." "Very good, sir." With their orders placed, and again without any distractions, the two held hands and discussed the day's events. In their mutual opinion, it had been a perfect day, and tonight was going to be the perfect ending to it. As they talked, they each looked around at the other guests. It was about as they expected, considering this hotel was not designed for frugal travelers. There was one obviously well-to-do family with 2 small children, and the rest were couples and singles dressed impeccably. Carol couldn't help but notice one man at the far end of the room who seemed to be keeping his eyes on her, and she smiled secretly to herself. She knew it had that effect on men, and it had been that way all her life. The stranger was handsome, and realizing what he was thinking gave her a brief thrill. Although she occasionally cast a glance in the stranger's direction and let him catch her eye, dinner demanded that she give her full attention to her husband. "I see you have an admirer." She looked at him with a slightly stunned expression on her face. "How did you know?" 16 years of practice, and a husband learning to read his wife. "And how do you know I'm not just admiring him?" "I know that look, too. If he wasn't watching you, your gazes would be more secretive." Carol paused for a moment. "I'm sorry, my love. That was rude of me." "Not at all. I understand all that. But the night is just beginning, and we have yet to dance, haven't we?" "Yes, absolutely. I expect you to dance till you drop. I want to show off that dress and make all the men in the audience envious of my husband." This brought a smile to Frank's face. Now there was little chance that tonight would be anything other than the best night of the entire trip. After the main course, the pair shared a dessert of crème brûlée and coffee, enjoying a few minutes of quiet conversation as they digested their meal. When it was time, they moved to the spacious bar, ordered drinks, and looked wistfully at the nearly empty dance floor. Carol took her time. "Why don't we wait until there are a few more dancing couples?" "I thought you wanted to show off your dress." Frank smiled anticipatively. Leaning forward, Carol replied, "Yes, but I want them to work on it." Frank knew his wife well and chuckled at the thought. Soon there were more couples dancing. Frank stood up, took his wife's hand, and escorted her to the dance floor. Holding her close, they swayed to the beat of the music and whispered quietly to each other. They had danced together many times, both before and after the wedding, and moved effortlessly to the sounds of the quintet, which seemed tailor-made for romantic couples who just needed an excuse to embrace their partner. About 20 minutes after they hit the dance floor, Carol noticed that her admirer had taken a table at the far end of the room from their own. He continued to watch her, and she felt a familiar shiver. There was little doubt how this night would end, but for now she snuggled closer to her husband. Husband and wife spent about an hour dividing their time between the dance floor and the table, dancing to the music and sipping drinks. Both were perfectly attuned to each other and knew each other's thoughts without too many questions. "Your admirer is back." Do you think he'll ask you to dance?" "Most likely." "And will you accept?" "Only if you say yes." Frank smiled and raised his eyebrows, and she realized she had his permission. Soon they were back at their table, and not a few minutes later, her suitor appeared in front of them. Looking only at Carol, he held out his hand to her. "Pardon me. I couldn't help but notice how beautifully you dance. May I have the pleasure of your next dance?" Carol didn't like the man's rudeness. "Well, you'll have to ask my husband if he'll give me permission." The man cast an impatient glance at her, then with a smug smile that radiated insincerity said, "You wouldn't mind if I danced with your wife, would you?" Frank considered telling him to leave, but after a glance at his wife, he realized that she found his audacity quite appropriate for a nighttime adventure, and somewhat reluctantly agreed. He watched the man escort his wife to the dance floor and thought, "That little asshole didn't even tell me his name." He watched them dance and saw that Carol was amused by it. She smiled and laughed at his remarks as he slowly led her to the other side of the dance floor where Frank couldn't see them. He only caught a glimpse of them dancing, and he thought he noticed the man's arm wiggle, but they remained in full view of the other dancers, and Frank let it go. Soon the man escorted Carol back to their table and thanked her for the dance. Frank thought, "It's actually been 3 dances, but who's counting?" Looking at his wife, Frank asked in a whisper so the neighbors wouldn't hear, "So, did you enjoy the dance?" Carol just shrugged and smiled. Nodding and taking a sip from her glass, Frank escorted his wife back to the dance floor for a few more dances. No sooner had they returned to their table than the man returned and asked Carol to dance again. This time she didn't look at her husband, but got up and followed him out onto the dance floor. This time they were gone much longer, and Frank saw that they had moved to the man's table on the other side of the dance floor, where they sat close together and talked conspiratorially. It was at least half an hour or more before she returned to her husband with the man's arm around Carol's waist. There was a smug expression on his face, as if he was the undisputed best man, and Frank felt a growing dislike for him. "Frank, darling, Jimmy invited me up to his room for a drink, and I thought I'd go. You don't mind, do you?" Frank looked at his wife, then at the man with a smug look on his face, then back at his wife. "And if I mind?" "Honey, don't be like that. It's just a little adventure. I'll be back for breakfast and then we can continue our vacation." With those words, she took her husband's hand, kissed him on the cheek, turned and left with Jimmy. Frank took a deep breath and glanced at his watch. It was barely 10 p.m. and he had a long night ahead of him. If Frank were being truthful, he'd say he'd be just as happy to do without these temptations his wife enjoyed so much and just focus on the two of them, but he'd long ago accepted that his wife's quirks were part of their marriage. He waited at the table for a moment to make sure his wife and Jimmy were already in the elevator and gone, then turned his palm to read the note she slipped him. "Room 426, was all it said. Now the question that occupied him was, how long should he wait? To arrive in time to save her honor, or to give her time to play with her toy? The next morning, Frank woke up lying naked on the bed. He could hear his wife dribbling water in the bathtub and humming to herself. She had obviously enjoyed the night before. She walked into the bedroom smiling. Carol was naked except for the towel she had used to dry her hair. "Well, hello, sleepyhead. Did you sleep well?" Taking a deep breath, Frank replied, "Yes." "Did you?" "I slept like a rock," and immediately laughed at her own joke. "We really should do something about the shower, Frank. I enjoyed all the sex last night, but a girl has to be clean in the morning." Frank flipped through his memory of the previous night and nodded to himself. It had been a perfect night. Without thinking about anything else, he got up and tiredly went to the bathroom. "You old man! You used to jump out of bed after a great night. You've gotten slower. Hurry up. Checkout is in an hour and we still have to pack." Frank only smiled. He had slowed down a bit, but knew he could still get the job done when the time came. He made his way to the bathroom, grabbed a washcloth off the rack, and started washing his face. He had always hated washing his hair in the sink, ever since his mother had washed it that way, and he figured his hair could wait until tonight. They got dressed and prepared to leave. As Carol headed for the door, Frank took one last look around the room. Everything looked in order, and they hadn't forgotten anything. He took one last look into the bathroom and saw Jimmy's lifeless body lying on the shower floor, blood long since drained from it. For a moment, Frank remembered their first murder and how they had almost been caught when they had left the victim's body lying on the floor and the couple in the room below noticed the wet spot that had formed on their ceiling. He thought again, too much liquid. The shower is the only place. Rejoining Carol, they left Jimmy's room and returned to their room to pack up and leave. Walking to the elevator, Carol snuggled up to her husband and whispered, "There's really nothing like it, is there? Making love to your wife in someone else's bed is the ultimate adventure." Frank had to admit to himself that it was indeed the most poignant sensation he had ever known, and they shared it often. "You took your time unlocking his door." Frank didn't get angry, but remarked. Jimmy was very persistent. There was no stopping him. Then, turning to her husband, she chuckled and said, "He didn't last long. I hope you didn't have to wait." Although they never talked about it, Carol never left with anyone who was polite and respectful to her husband. She never chose someone who could be called a nice guy. Frank was comforted by that. He never felt guilty about the men he'd killed for her. Each of them had been mean to him, and each deserved his fate. After checking out of their room, They carried their overnight bags down the street and around the corner where they caught a passing cab that took them across town to where they parked their car. Frank and Carol had fake IDs and credit cards in different names, and they always registered other people's cars, but he wondered how easily their car could be identified on the streets and highways. And they never parked in hotel parking lots. Frank was cautious. Carol was a free spirit. Carol looked lovingly at her husband. It was a wonderful ending to the first week of our vacation, and there's still a whole week to go. With some hesitation in her voice, which may have been due more to manipulation than request, she asked, "Do you think we can do it again on this trip?" Frank smiled and nodded. "I guess we'll just have to see what this week brings." The end. Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.